You're watching Access Minnesota. Here's Jim Dubois.
In the United States, we have the Society of Professional Journalists. It's an association that represents broadcast and print journalists. It provides a code of ethical conduct. Are we seeing organizations like that developing in other countries?
Well, a big difference in many of these other countries is that they have very strong unions of journalists that pre-exist the democratic systems. I mean, interestingly enough, in the communist era, for example, unions of journalists were very common, and most of their focus was on what we today would characterize as sort of central employer-employee kind of relationships, such as they were in that environment. I think, though, that there is a great hunger among the journalists in emerging societies to try to professionalize what it is that they do. Many of them in previous regimes were basically just the public relations arm of the government of the day. They had very little discretion about what they could report on, and they ran considerable risk if they ran afoul from the official line. Now you take that lid off, and you're left with the opportunity to make those determinations for yourself. And I know that when I worked in Poland, for example, shortly after the fall of the communist regime there, that journalists were really hungry for guidance about what was the right thing to do, what was the appropriate thing to do, particularly on issues like invasion of privacy, for example. And to the extent that the law in their own country didn't spell that out, they were sometimes left with a dilemma along the lines of saying, well, if the law doesn't say I can't do it, then it must be all right to do it. And so to move to the next level, to say it may be legally permissible to do something, you may have the right to do something, but to ask the question, but is it the right thing to do? That's the level of sophistication that we're gradually seeing. And I think that journalists in many of these countries have, frankly, much to teach us here in the United States about how to approach these kinds of questions.
In the United States, we have the First Amendment that protects free speech rights. In other countries, though, there's no similar constitutional protection. That begs the question, can a free press society exist without the freedom of speech?
Well, that's an excellent question. There are a variety of international conventions that talk about freedom of speech and the press being fundamental rights. And many of the countries that, for example, have recently joined the European Union are now signatories to those conventions. So they're having to put their laws into conformance with those general principles. But not too long ago in Hungary, a new media law was passed. It's over 200 pages in length, and there was a lot of controversy about the kind of control that was going to be asserted by the government in terms of regulating what the press did. And I think it's an excellent object lesson about how even in a country like Hungary, which most people regarded as one of the most intellectually and politically sophisticated of the former Soviet satellite countries, even there is still the possibility that government is going to sort of relapse into the control model unless there is a really strong constitutional provision that makes it clear that they can't do that. And I would add one other thing. It's not enough to just have it as a constitutional or statutory provision. You have to have an independent judiciary that is prepared to actually enforce those provisions, because they aren't self-executing. It's all very well to have those provisions, and in fact, if you look at, for example, the Constitution of the old Soviet Union, they had provisions for freedom of the press too, but it was pretty meaningless in that context. So all of these pieces really fit together in order to ensure a free press.
How does a website like WikiLeaks fit into the notion of a free press society?
Well, I guess it depends on who you ask. Julian Assange in December, I believe, announced, for the first time really to the world, that he believes he is practicing journalism. I think he calls it scientific journalism. Prior to that time, I think that was not the position that WikiLeaks as an institution was taking. They were not saying they were a journalism group. They said that they were a conduit of information. They have in the past collaborated with traditional news media sources, including the New York Times, Der Spiegel in Germany, The Guardian in London, and others. And many people believe that they did that because they thought that those traditional news media sources had greater credibility in the eyes of the public than perhaps something like WikiLeaks would. But I think really the debate about whether technically WikiLeaks is journalism with a capital J or not is really, we're past that point. Because the reality is that they are gathering information and they are communicating it to the public. And if that's not journalism, I don't know what is. Now, whether it's responsible journalism is, of course, a question that we could discuss and debate for hours, and I think that there's much to criticize in some of the decisions that WikiLeaks has made. But having said that, would I defend them as engaging in journalism? Yes, I would.
In the United Kingdom, we have the British Broadcasting Corporation, the BBC, which is funded by the federal government in Britain and also by license fees that listeners and viewers pay. So it's a little different model than what we have for public broadcasting here in the United States. Is that system better in essence because it doesn't take money from listener contributions or from underwriters?
Well, it's different, and you know, BBC and those who criticize the BBC, and there are lots of people in Britain who do, would say that although you know it has a news gathering operation that many people would say, especially on the international level, is second to none. The fact is, it has not been without controversy. It has been subject to the same kinds of criticism and attacks from Parliament that we would see here in the United States. And I really cannot imagine that the American public would buy into the idea of a licensing, paying a license fee to have a television set. So I don't think something like that's going to happen. Having said that, I think that part of the issue, or at least the tension in a situation dealing with public radio or public television, is where there is at least a perception that underwriters may control or skew the viewpoint or even the content of the kind of things that NPR or PBS might produce or might commission. Again, this is always going to be the problem. What's the best model for having an independent press? I remember many years ago meeting with some journalists from the People's Republic of China. They insisted to me that we could not possibly have a free press in the United States. And the reason for that was because they said the vast majority of your media are dependent upon commercial advertising, and you submit to whatever those advertisers demand. I, of course, said that that was not true, but I think that we cannot ignore the fact that, especially in this time of expanding media but shrinking revenue sources, that those kinds of decisions can be affected by who you're getting your money from. So I have yet to find the perfect system. Public subsidies, individual subscriptions, advertising, I mean, these are all possibilities, and I think we're in the midst of a great experiment yet again to try to figure out what the best choice might be. I'm not sure there is a best choice. I think that there are a number of options out there, and different ones work for different people.
Professor Jane Kirtley, thanks so much for joining us on Access Minnesota.
Thank you.
Access Minnesota will return after these messages.